June 4th, 1942, 10:26 a.m. The Central Pacific. The sky above Midway Atoll was a canvas of chaos. Smoke spiraled upward in thick black columns, mingling with the salt-heavy air that clung to the skin of every man aboard the USS Enterprise. The flight deck trembled beneath the boots of aircraft handlers as dive bombers roared back from their runs, their engines screaming a metallic hymn of war. In the radio room, deep within the carrier's steel belly, radioman third-class Harold Jensen sat hunched over his receiver, one earphone pressed tight against his head, the other hanging loose so he could hear the frantic shouts of his commanding officer. The static crackled and hissed, a violent sea of electromagnetic noise punctuated by fragments of voices, some American, some not. Then, cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk, came a voice. High-pitched, rapid, desperate. Speaking Japanese. Jensen's fingers froze above his notepad. He didn't speak the language fluently, but he'd been trained to recognize the tonal patterns, the rhythm of urgency. This wasn't the disciplined, clipped communication of a coordinated strike force. This was panic. Raw, unfiltered panic. The voice rose and fell in frantic bursts, words tumbling over one another in a cascade of syllables that carried the unmistakable weight of catastrophe. Jensen's hand moved instinctively, scribbling phonetic approximations, timestamps, frequency markers. He didn't know what the words meant, but he understood their music, the music of men watching their world burn. Within minutes, the transmission was relayed up the chain of command. By noon, it had reached Admiral Chester Nimitz's desk at Pearl Harbor. By evening, cryptographers and Japanese language specialists had dissected every syllable, every pause, every crack in the speaker's voice. What they found would rewrite the doctrine of naval warfare for generations to come. That panicked transmission, born in the death throes of the Japanese carrier. Kaga, as American bombs tore through her flight deck, was not just a cry for help. It was a confession, a revelation of vulnerability that the United States Navy would never forget. In the months leading to that June morning, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been the unchallenged master of the Pacific. Their carrier strike force, the WWII, was a weapon of terrifying efficiency, a mobile fortress of steel and aviation fuel that had humiliated the Western powers from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. Japanese naval doctrine, honed over decades of study and war games, emphasized the decisive battle, the single overwhelming engagement that would shatter enemy morale and secure dominion over the sea. Their carriers were the tip of this spear, concentrated into a single armored fist designed to deliver knockout blows before the enemy could respond. The men who commanded these carriers believed in the supremacy of their tactics. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the soft-spoken architect of the Pearl Harbor raid, had seen his planes reduce battleships to burning hulks and airfields to rubble. His pilots were the finest in the world, veterans of campaigns in China and across the Pacific, men who could land a zero on a pitching carrier deck in a typhoon and make it look easy. The doctrine was clear: concentrate your forces, strike hard, strike first, and the enemy will crumble. It had worked in Hawaii, it had worked in the Philippines, in Java, in Ceylon. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't work again, but the Americans were learning. They were learning in the wreckage of their own ships, in the blood-soaked waters of Coral Sea, in the sleepless nights of intelligence officers poring over intercepted messages. They were learning that the Japanese doctrine, for all its elegance, carried a fatal flaw, a flaw that would only become visible when the perfect plan met the chaos of battle. The Japanese expected Midway to be another triumph. They expected the Americans to react, predictably to scatter their forces to fight defensively. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack, believed that luring the American carriers into a trap would end the Pacific War before it truly began. Destroy the carriers, he reasoned, and the United States would have no choice but to negotiate. The plan was meticulous, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north, followed by an overwhelming assault on Midway Atoll that would force the U.S. Navy to commit its remaining carriers to a battle they couldn't win. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, would form the core of the strike force, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was a fleet designed to obliterate opposition. What the Japanese didn't know was that American cryptographers had broken their naval code. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, a cramped basement filled with linguists and mathematicians working around the clock, had intercepted and decrypted enough Japanese communications to predict the attack on Midway with startling accuracy. Admiral Nimitz, a man of quiet confidence and calculated risk, made a decision that would define his career. He would set an ambush. Instead of dispersing his carriers, he would concentrate them, not in a single group, but in two task forces positioned northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon, waiting for the Japanese to commit. The Americans expected to be outnumbered. They expected to face the finest naval aviators in the world. What they didn't expect was the gift that panic would hand them. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese planes roared off the decks of the WWII bound for Midway. The attack was devastating but not decisive. American defenses, though battered, held. And then came the moment that changed everything. A Japanese scout plane, launching late due to mechanical issues, spotted American ships far to the northeast. The report was vague. Incomplete ships, possibly including a carrier. Nagumo faced a dilemma. His planes were returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed for a second strike on the atoll. Torpedoes meant for ships were being swapped out for bombs meant for land targets. To rearm for an anti-ship strike would take time he might not have. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, the Americans struck. Douglas dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown, having searched the empty ocean for hours, finally found the Japanese carriers. The timing was perfect, and perfectly accidental. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters that guarded the fleet, had been drawn down to sea level chasing American torpedo bombers. The dive bombers, approaching from 14,000 feet, were unopposed. At 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his stick forward and dove. Behind him, 32 aircraft followed, screaming down through the thin air at terminal velocity. The bombs fell. The first hit struck Kaga amidships, punching through the wooden flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay below. The hangar was a death trap. Fuel lines ruptured, ammunition cooked off, aviation gasoline ignited in a roaring fireball that turned the interior of the ship into a blast furnace. Men were incinerated where they stood. Others, engulfed in flames, threw themselves into the sea. The ship's damage control teams, trained and disciplined, fought desperately to contain the fires, but the devastation was too complete, too sudden. It was in the midst of this inferno that the transmission went out. A radio operator, surrounded by smoke and heat and the screams of dying men, keyed his microphone and began to speak. His voice, captured by American receivers and preserved in the archives of naval intelligence, was shaking. The words came in a frantic torrent. Reports of fires out of control, of casualties overwhelming the medical stations, of ammunition exploding below decks. He begged for assistance, for water, for guidance. And then, in a moment of unguarded truth, he said something that would echo through the halls of American naval strategy for decades. He said they were alone. The American translators working through the static and the terror in the voice parsed the message. The Japanese carriers, for all their coordination on the approach, were now isolated in their agony. The Kaga wasn't calling to the Akagi or the Soryu for support. She was calling into the void. The careful concentration of Japanese forces, the doctrine of massed carrier power, had become a liability. When the bombs fell, they fell on ships packed together, unable to maneuver, unable to disperse. And when those ships burned, they burned alone, each crew fighting its own losing battle against fire and flooding, unable to aid the others. The American commanders listening to the intercepts saw the pattern. The Japanese had committed everything to the single decisive battle, and when that battle turned against them, they had no fallback, no reserve, no flexibility. Their carriers, concentrated for striking power, became concentrated targets. Their doctrine, designed for offense, left them defenseless when the initiative slipped away. The lessons were immediate and brutal. Within weeks of Midway, American naval planners began revising carrier tactics. The old pre-war doctrine, which had also emphasized concentration, was quietly shelved. In its place came a new philosophy: dispersion, redundancy, and independent action. American carriers would no longer operate in tight formations. Instead, they would spread out across the ocean, each task force capable of operating independently, each carrier supported by its own screen of destroyers and cruisers. If one carrier was hit, the others could continue the fight. If one task force was ambushed, the others could respond from unexpected directions. The concept of the carrier task force was born at Midway, shaped by the sound of that panicked Japanese voice. Each task force became a self-contained unit of war, a carrier, a battleship or two for anti-aircraft support, cruisers for surface combat, destroyers for anti-submarine screening. These task forces could coordinate their actions, but they didn't depend on each other for survival. They were resilient, adaptable, and above all, survivable. By 1943, the doctrine had evolved further. The Fast Carrier Task Force, designated Task Force 38 or 58, depending on the command rotation, became the most powerful naval weapon in history. Instead of 4 carriers concentrated in one location, the Americans deployed 12, 16, even 20 carriers spread across multiple task groups, each capable of launching strikes independently or in coordination. The Japanese, rebuilding their shattered carrier fleet, could never match this flexibility. They tried to concentrate their remaining forces for one more decisive battle, one more knockout blow. At the Philippine Sea in 1944, they lost 3 carriers and nearly 600 aircraft in a slaughter the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Leyte Gulf later that year, they lost the last of their carriers' striking power. The panic transmission from the Kaga had revealed a truth that the Japanese High Command would never fully grasp. In modern naval warfare, concentration was a double-edged sword. It multiplied your striking power, but it also multiplied your vulnerability. The Americans, by contrast, learned to spread their power across the ocean, to be everywhere and nowhere, to strike from multiple directions and vanish before the enemy could respond. It was a doctrine born from listening to the enemy's fear, from understanding that the moment of panic was also a moment of revelation. Aboard the Kaga, the fires raged for hours. Damage control teams, their faces blackened by smoke and seared by heat, fought until the heat became unbearable and the decks too hot to stand on. The captain, Jisaku Okada, remained on the bridge until the end, directing the evacuation of survivors even as the ship listed heavily to port. At 4:25 p.m., the order to abandon ship was given. Men slid down ropes into the oil-slicked water, swimming away from the dying carrier as secondary explosions tore through her hull. At 7:25 p.m., the Kaga rolled over and sank, taking with her 811 men, more than half her crew. The radio operator who sent that desperate transmission was not among the survivors. His name is lost to history, recorded only as a voice on a frequency, a fragment of sound preserved in the static of war. But his words lived on. They lived on in the after-action reports filed by American intelligence officers. They lived on in the tactical manuals distributed to carrier captains in 1943 and 1944. They lived on in the doctrine that would guide the U.S. Navy through the rest of the Pacific War and into the Cold War beyond. In a sense, that unknown Japanese sailor became a teacher to his enemies. His panic, his honesty in the face of death, stripped away the veneer of invincibility that had surrounded the WWII. It showed the Americans that the Japanese, for all their skill and courage, were bound by a doctrine that couldn't adapt to chaos. And chaos, as the Americans learned to embrace, was the true nature of carrier warfare. The transformation in American naval thinking was not just tactical, it was philosophical. Before Midway, many American admirals still clung to the idea of the battleship as the queen of the seas, the carrier as a mere support vessel. After Midway, after hearing the death cries of the Kaga and seeing the results of dive bomber attacks, there could be no doubt. The aircraft carrier was the new capital ship, and the nation that could build, deploy, and coordinate carriers most effectively would rule the Pacific. But it was more than just a matter of ships and planes. The American approach to carrier warfare became a reflection of American industrial and democratic values, values that the Japanese transmission had inadvertently highlighted. The Japanese concentrated their forces because they had limited resources, limited shipbuilding capacity, limited reserves of trained pilots. They had to make every ship, every plane, every pilot count. The Americans, by contrast, had the luxury of abundance. By 1944, American shipyards were launching one Essex-class carrier every month. Pilot training programs were churning out aviators by the thousands. The logistics network supplying the fleet could sustain operations thousands of miles from home for months on end. This abundance allowed for dispersion. The Americans didn't need to concentrate their carriers into a single vulnerable group because they had enough carriers to spread across the ocean. They didn't need to hoard their aircraft because replacement planes were already on their way. They didn't need to preserve every pilot because new pilots, well-trained and eager, were waiting in the pipeline. The panic in the Japanese operator's voice was, in a way, the sound of a nation realizing it was fighting an enemy that could afford to lose and still win. In the wreckage of the WWII, the Japanese Navy tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, new formations, new doctrines designed to counter the American carrier juggernaut. But they were always reacting, always one step behind. The initiative, lost on that June morning, never returned. Admiral Nagumo, haunted by the decisions he made at Midway, would die 2 years later during the American invasion of Saipan, taking his own life rather than face capture. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the carrier war, would be shot down over the Solomon Islands in 1943, his death the result of another intercepted transmission, another moment where American intelligence turned Japanese words into American advantage. The men who survived the sinking of the Kaga were scattered across the Pacific. Some ended up in the shipyards, helping to build the new carriers that would never match the quality of the originals. Some became instructors, trying to pass on the lessons of Midway to pilots who would never fly as well as the men they replaced. A few survived the war and returned to Japan, carrying with them memories of the day the sky fell, the day their invincible fleet burned. In the decades after the war, historians and naval analysts would dissect the Battle of Midway from every angle, examining every decision, every stroke of luck, every moment of brilliance or failure. The story of the panicked transmission became a footnote, a small detail in the larger narrative. But to the men who were there, to the radiomen who heard it, and the commanders who acted on it, that transmission was the turning point within the turning point, the moment when the enemy's doctrine, the enemy's vulnerabilities, became crystal clear. The symbolism of that transmission extended beyond tactics and strategy. It became a symbol of what happened when rigid doctrine met fluid reality, when the plan collided with the chaos of battle. The Japanese had built their carrier force on the principle of perfection, perfect coordination, perfect execution, perfect concentration. But war is never perfect. War is noise and confusion, fear and improvisation, luck and desperation. The Americans, perhaps because they were newer to carrier warfare, perhaps because their democratic culture valued initiative and flexibility, learned to thrive in that chaos. They learned to trust their junior officers, to give their task force commanders wide latitude, to embrace the unpredictability of combat. This philosophy extended to the men themselves. American carrier crews were trained not just to follow orders, but to adapt when orders became obsolete. Damage control teams drilled endlessly in containing fires and floods, preparing for the moment when the ship would be hit. Unlike the Japanese, who often kept their damage control equipment locked away to prevent theft or misuse, the Americans made sure every sailor knew where the firefighting gear was and how to use it. When American carriers were hit, and they were hit, often and hard, they survived. The Yorktown took bombs and torpedoes at Coral Sea and was patched up in time to fight at Midway. The Enterprise was hit repeatedly throughout the war and earned the nickname the Big E for her endurance. The new Essex-class carriers, designed with the lessons of Midway in mind, had armored flight decks, redundant systems, and compartmentalization that could contain the kind of catastrophic damage that had doomed the Kaga in minutes. The Japanese, meanwhile, built beautiful ships, elegant, efficient, deadly. But they were fragile. Their carriers lacked the redundancy and damage control systems of American designs. When they were hit, they burned. And when they burned, their crews, brave and disciplined though they were, often couldn't save them. There was a recurring sound in that transmission, a background noise that the translators noted, but didn't emphasize in their reports. Beneath the operator's panicked voice, beneath the static and the interference, there was a low, constant roar, the sound of fire consuming the ship. It was a sound that would become familiar to anyone who studied the recordings of naval battles in the Pacific. Fire was the great equalizer, the force that turned steel ships into funeral pyres, that rendered doctrine and training and courage meaningless. The Americans learned to respect fire, to fear it, to prepare for it. The Japanese, perhaps because their early successes had been so complete, perhaps because their culture valued offensive spirit over defensive preparation, never quite did. That sound, the roar of uncontrollable fire, became a ghost that haunted Japanese carrier operations for the rest of the war. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when the carrier Taiho was hit by a single submarine torpedo, a damage control officer made a fatal mistake. He ordered the ship's ventilation systems turned on to clear gasoline fumes from a ruptured fuel line. Instead of clearing the fumes, the ventilation spread them throughout the ship. Hours later, a spark ignited the vapors, and the Taiho, the newest and most advanced carrier in the Japanese fleet, exploded from within. The fire consumed her in minutes. Over 1,600 men died, including the admiral in command of the fleet. The Americans, hearing the reports, studied the incident. They revised their damage control procedures, added more firefighting equipment, trained their crews even harder. The Japanese, their resources stretched thin, their experienced personnel dwindling, could only watch as the gap widened. By the end of 1944, the transformation of American carrier doctrine was complete. The fast carrier task force had become a self-sustaining organism, a mobile city of steel and aircraft that could project power anywhere in the Pacific. Each carrier operated as part of a task group, usually paired with another carrier and screened by a ring of destroyers and cruisers. These task groups, in turn, coordinated their actions through radio and radar, maintaining separation to avoid concentration of targets while still supporting each other with overlapping air cover. When they launched strikes, they did so in waves, fighters to suppress enemy air defenses, dive bombers to hit carriers and cruisers, torpedo bombers to finish off crippled ships. The attacks were coordinated but not concentrated, allowing for flexibility and redundancy. The Japanese, by contrast, were reduced to kamikaze attacks, desperate suicidal dives by pilots with minimal training, flying planes that were often obsolete or barely airworthy. The panicked transmission from the Kaga had come from a highly trained operator aboard one of the finest carriers in the world, a man trying to save his ship with all the skill and technology at his disposal. The kamikaze pilots, 3 years later, were teenagers with a few dozen hours of flight time, ramming their planes into American ships because conventional tactics had failed so completely that suicide was the only option left. The contrast was stark, and it spoke to the deeper transformation that the American doctrine had undergone. The Americans had learned to survive, to endure, to come back stronger after every setback. The Japanese had learned only how to die with honor. In the quiet halls of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, instructors would play recordings of that transmission for decades after the war. They would let the young officers, the future admirals and captains, hear the panic in the Japanese operator's voice. And then they would dissect the moment, what it revealed about enemy doctrine, about the vulnerabilities of concentration, about the importance of damage control and redundancy. The transmission became a teaching tool, a reminder that even in the age of nuclear-powered supercarriers and jet aircraft, the fundamental lessons of Midway still applied. Flexibility over rigidity, redundancy over concentration, adaptation over doctrine. Those principles, born in the fire that consumed the Kaga, would guide the U.S. Navy through the Cold War, through Vietnam, through the Gulf Wars, and into the 21st century. Carrier battle groups became carrier strike groups. The nomenclature changed, the technology advanced beyond recognition, but the core philosophy remained. Spread your forces, maintain independent action, never give the enemy a single target to concentrate on, never rely on perfection. The Kaga rests now in 2 miles of water, her steel bones scattered across the ocean floor, a monument to the men who fought and died aboard her. Occasionally, research vessels pass overhead, their sonar painting ghostly images of the wreckage. The flight deck is gone, collapsed into the hangar bay. The bridge is a twisted ruin. The bones of aircraft, never launched, lie tangled in the debris, and somewhere in that wreckage, lost to time and tide, are the remains of the radio room where an unknown operator spoke his last words to a world that was listening more carefully than he knew. His transmission, that panicked fragment of sound, changed the course of the Pacific War. It didn't sink a ship or shoot down a plane, it didn't kill a single enemy soldier, but it taught the United States Navy how to win. Not through a single decisive battle, not through perfect execution of a flawless plan, but through resilience, through adaptation, through the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. It taught them that the enemy, for all their skill and courage, were human, that they could panic, that they could fail, that their doctrine, however elegant, had cracks, and in those cracks the Americans found victory. In the end, the story of that transmission is a story about listening, about paying attention not just to what the enemy says, but to how they say it. About understanding that in the tone of a voice, in the rhythm of panic, there are lessons to be learned. The Americans listened to that voice, and they heard the future, a future where carriers would rule the seas, where flexibility would triumph over rigidity, where abundance would outlast scarcity. The Japanese operator, in his final moments, was trying to save his ship. Instead, he saved his enemies from repeating his nation's mistakes. That is the bitter irony of war, that sometimes the greatest lessons are taught by those who lose, and the greatest victories are built on listening to the dying. The transmission lasted less than a minute. Its echoes have lasted 80 years.